Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 5th episode of the Wally Pod, a show where I interview my peers who are embarking on their careers in areas from investment banking to software engineering to entrepreneurship and more. We explore the lessons they learn navigating college, their plan for future success, and the views they hold on the future of the world as the next generation that is taking the reins. Subscribe to join me weekly for informational and motivating interviews. If you've enjoyed the podcast so far, I'd really appreciate it if you could forward it on to one other person that you think would enjoy it as well. The shows are much more fun for me to make when I know that I have an audience. I've also created an email newsletter that will keep you up to date on the newest episodes. The link to sign up is in the description. Now, in this episode, we talk with my friend Kyle Zielinski, discussing his path from his experience in the School of Pharmacy to working at one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. We talk drug prices and about his incredible research experiences, from trying to grow nerve cells in the spine to receiving one of the most competitive research fellowships at the University of Wisconsin to study the chronic brain condition hydrocephalus. Without further ado, here's our conversation. All right, Kyle, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Wally, for having me. I appreciate you extending the invitation to be out here.
Of course. I'm happy to have you on. And I asked you on for many reasons. We've been friends for a couple of years now. We met at Wisconsin, and we're both going to be living in Chicago. You're already there. I'll be moving in September, and very much looking forward to that. Why don't you give everyone a brief bio of yourself, pre-college, where you grew up, what interests you had growing up, and how you ended up at Madison?
Yeah, so I grew up in Mount Prospect, Illinois, which is a northwest suburb of Chicago. And I went to Prospect High School. There I was involved mostly with athletics. That was kind of my focus. So I was playing football, basketball, volleyball. And then school was kind of like a side gig for me, so to speak. I wasn't too interested in my classes just because I didn't find anything that really interested me. So I was taking all sorts of breadth classes, whether they be, business classes, science classes, and the APs and all that. And I didn't really find anything I liked until my senior year, where I was accepted into this district-wide course called Med Academy. And so through that course, I was exposed to some high-level science concepts, and I had the opportunity to shadow 2 days a week at local hospitals and local clinics. And so I was shadowing healthcare professionals, everything from physicians to nurses, technicians, all of that. And so that kind of directed my initial education plan for college. And then specifically, I know you mentioned this, Wally, but we both went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so I decided to go to Madison ultimately because I have a big family presence there. My dad grew up in northern Wisconsin, and I have a great family network out there. So that's kind of what motivated me to go to Madison. And my experiences later in high school really pushed me to pursue the STEM route.
You just mentioned it a bit, but going into college, what were your kind of more specific career thoughts? Did you have a certain path like in mind going to Madison? And academic wise, you said you're interested in STEM. Did you know right away you were going to go into the pharmacy school?
Yeah, so actually coming into Madison, I had no clue what I wanted to study. I just knew that ultimately I wanted to become a doctor. And so initially I thought, well, I might as well study biology. It seems like that's what everyone does that wants to become a physician. So I did entertain that idea for a little while, but then after doing a little bit of research, because I figured that, I might want to do something after college in between realizing my ultimate goal and graduating. So I figured that that wasn't hireable. So then what I did was I did a little bit of research, and I conducted laboratory research. I explored multiple avenues, and I learned of the pharmacy school's undergraduate program in pharmacology and toxicology. And for those of you that don't know, pharmacology is basically the study of drugs and how they work in your body. And then toxicology is essentially how toxins affect your body. So it's analogous. And so I discovered this program, and it was pretty interesting to me because I had always been relatively interested in drug pricing and drug related crises and things like that. So I just figured this was a good fit for me. So I actually ended up applying to that program following my sophomore year, and I was accepted during my junior year. So it was a 2-year program, and yeah, I just graduated from that, and I couldn't be happier.
Awesome. Why don't you dive a little farther into that? How does the experience in the pharmacy school differ from, say, other students doing like the biology route? What sort of courses and different experiences do you get in that school than, say, other pre-med students are getting?
Yeah, so the pharmacy school is incredibly different from just the other STEM majors available at Madison. And specifically, for the first 2 years, it's essentially the same. So I took the organic chemistries and the biochemistries. I took all the same courses as a biology major would take for the most part. But then the differences come your junior year and your senior year when you're taking your coursework with other professional health students. So that's the biggest difference, is that it's essentially a graduate school program, but at the second half of your undergraduate career. So all of my classmates were pharmacists or future pharmacists, and all of my classmates were future PhDs. So we learned a lot of material that was much more applicable to a healthcare profession, because for the most part, the people in my classes were going to be practicing on humans within the next 2 years of taking these courses. So it was just very relevant and very specialized. And I think that's what I liked about it is, it was very specialized. It was a very niche subject, and it gave me something to leverage when I was searching for an internship and I was searching for a career, because I had that specialized knowledge that no biology majors really learn, that because I learned the same biology concepts, but then I learned how to apply those to real life things, like for example drugs and pharmaceutical agents.
Is the goal for most people that are in that school to become a pharmacist, or are the paths pretty varied? Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, so it's a pretty interesting division between my classmates. I would say that about half, so there's 20 of us in my cohort. So there's 2 years, obviously, so 40 people in the program in total at any given time. So out of the 20 of us in my program, I would say that about half want to be pharmacists. And, there are opportunities at Madison to go directly into the pharmacy school and do 6 years. And it's my understanding that some people just want to have that undergraduate degree in addition to their pharmacy degree. So, which is why they would pursue this route. And so, little side note, once we graduate, then if they want to pursue the pharmacy route, they only have to do an additional 2 years, given the crossover between the classes. And then I'd say about 25% of people wanted to pursue healthcare in a certain capacity, like, for example, a physician. And then the remaining 25% was interested in either industry or research. So pursuing a PhD.
Okay, so freshman year, I know that or I didn't know this freshman year, but I know you're in the Wisconsin Pre-Med Society, and I read that you joined it freshman year and you eventually became the president of the club. Can you talk about that experience, how you got into the club freshman year, and kind of how you grew over the years and your roles in the club?
Yeah, so freshman year, I was looking for some extra supplementation, or I don't know what you want to call it, but just something extra to take up my free time because I wasn't taking too many classes. And so I ended up joining the Wisconsin Pre-Medical Society. It was one of the, I would say, three largest or three main pre-med societies on campus. Because as you remember, this is the time that I was set on going to medical school and eventually becoming a doctor right out of school. So I was preparing myself for that. So I ended up joining this organization, and about a week or two into the school year, they opened up the application for the freshman representative. So the freshman representative was essentially a liaison between the freshmen that just joined the organization, which most of the new members are actually freshmen. And then this freshman representative also acts on the board of the organization. And so they kind of connect the upperclassmen that are running the organization with the freshmen that make up a majority of the club. So fortunately, I was elected to that position. And then following that, I ended up becoming the secretary, which was an executive position, just helped out around the organization. And I actually founded the physician shadowing program at that point, which is just a way that we connected our members with physicians at UW Hospital for shadowing purposes. And then ultimately, I ended up becoming the president for the past year, which was definitely interesting given the COVID-19 situation. It was more like 3/4 of a year I was the president. Yeah, so it was definitely a big part of my undergraduate experience. And I would say that I definitely leveraged my positions in this org as sort of leadership positions that I could talk about in interviews, which helped me get, a full-time job and an internship position as well.
Mm-hmm. Did you get to develop any really meaningful relationships through that club with either other members, or did you participate? I assume you participated in the shadow program that you helped co-found.
Yeah, so definitely my participation in the shadowing program was important to learn networking skills. A lot of my fellow classmates in my science classes who wanted to be physicians actually come from families where they have a parent who's a physician. So that really makes the networking easy, and it makes building those relationships very, pretty straightforward. I didn't have that luxury actually. So I think that building this program really helped me to reach out and to kind of exit my comfort zone, to build those relationships, because a lot of times you just have to do it from a cold email, and it's not super organic. So I think that experience really helped me refine those skills in myself.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And another thing that happened for you during your freshman year is that you joined a lab in the Department of Neurological Surgery through the Wisconsin Undergraduate Research Program. Can you tell us about the program and how you got into that lab specifically?
I think that this is actually one of the most valuable experiences of my undergraduate career, or at least the most formative. So the undergraduate research scholar program is something that's available to first and second year students, and it essentially facilitates that relationship between student and research mentor. It's, as you can imagine, it's pretty tough to just come into college and immediately find a research lab.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes you have to email these professors begging for a position, and they get filled up pretty quickly. So there are certain professors that preferentially choose students in this program. So I figured that was a great way to just get my foot in the door. I was fortunately accepted into this program before coming to Madison.
How did that happen? What do you mean how did you get into it before coming to Madison?
Well, it's something you apply to prior to coming to school. So at SOAR, which is our orientation, you apply to this program. And so I didn't really know anything about it. I just saw that it said research, and I was like, oh, I kind of want to do research. So I applied to it not really knowing what to expect. So then when I came to Madison for my first day of classes, I did end up going to my first day of undergraduate research scholars. And essentially what they did is they gave us a list, like, here's all these professors that are willing to accept you into their lab. All you have to do is go interview with them.
Mm-hmm.
So here's their contact information. Here's a little bit about their lab, and go off and do it. So I was looking through this paper, and most of them did not seem too appealing to me. It was mostly like cellular work and stuff that I just, it seemed too abstract of a concept. And then I saw neurosurgery, and I saw that it was kind of a surgical position. I was like, wow, it's pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think few people have an opportunity to join a surgical based lab. And I think that, at the time I'm thinking med school all the way. So I'm like, wow, that actually might be something that I could utilize moving forward. And I think that it's super applicable to what I want to do. I ended up reaching out to the professor, and I got the position. And that really shaped much of my research experience and undergraduate career as well. So it was this relationship with the professor.
Yeah, and why don't you tell us about your research and what all you did in the lab?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here. At first, I'm going to focus on my laboratory research.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to start. So again, like you mentioned, I was working in the Department of Neurological Surgery under Dr. Benny Iskandar, who's a practicing pediatric neurosurgeon. And so this is just something that he did on the side, was running this research laboratory. And at a very high level, what we were doing was trying to regrow nerve cells. So when you experience a traumatic brain stem injury or spinal cord injury, as we call it. That's why people get paralyzed for life, because these neurons or these nerve cells simply don't regrow. So what we were doing is supplementing nerve cells with B vitamins, and then we actually saw that these nerves had the capacity to regrow or regenerate beyond the site of injury. So specifically, when I started, my role was to prepare specimens for examination under the microscope, which actually meant that I had to sacrifice these rodents that we were working on, rats and mice, and prepare them to be looked at under the microscope. And then from there, I kind of moved on and actually learned some of the surgeries myself. So as I mentioned, this was a surgical based laboratory. And so we had to generate these spinal cord phenotypes, injured phenotype. So I would actually perform a spinal cord surgery on rats and mice as a freshman, sophomore student, which was really fantastic and really motivated me to keep with it and focus on my research. Following that, my research progressed over the years. I stayed with the laboratory for 4 years, and it really developed into more than I could have ever asked for. I had a ton of different avenues to pursue, and ultimately my senior year, actually it was my junior year, I kind of went off on a side project with Dr. Iskandar, and I'm sure we're going to get into this in a second, but I did end up applying to a fellowship junior year at Madison, and this fellowship was actually related to clinical research, which is something that I had not been involved in previously. And Dr. Iskandar actually came up to me and invited me to begin working with a special subset of patients of his patient population that he operates on that have hydrocephalus, which is a brain condition. So after beginning that side project, which is actually turned into my main research focus, even following graduation, I was conducting both laboratory research, which I kind of put on the side burner, and then I was mainly focusing on clinical research and building up that expertise.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a moment, but I don't want to totally skim over your lab-based research. It sounds incredibly interesting, but for those of us without a science background, can you give some more background on what it really means to be regrowing nerve cells, specifically in the spinal cord, and the history of the lab that you joined?
So at a very high level, what we were doing, I'll give you a little background information first. So the human body has two different types of nerve cells, or two different nervous systems, I should say. There's the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord, and that's one separate entity. And then you have the peripheral nervous system, which is all the other nerves in your body that aren't in your spinal cord or in your brain. So these two different nervous systems are actually very different in the way that they react to an injury. So if you injure a peripheral nerve in your hand, let's say, it has the capacity to regrow, or it can heal from its injury, which is why you could burn your hand, but then eventually, 2 weeks later, a year later, you have full sensation in your hand. That's very different from the nerves in your spinal cord and your brain, which is why some people, let's say you get into a skiing accident or a car accident, something like that, and you injure your spinal cord, oftentimes these people are paralyzed for life because these nerves, once you injure them, they're not going to heal.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the base knowledge that you need. However, what we found in our laboratory, and this research was ongoing for like 20 years before I got there, was that if you take this B vitamin, it's called folate, and it's actually supplemented to pregnant women, what you find is that in a rat and mouse model, if you injure these nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord that typically do not regrow whatsoever, and then you supplement these animals with this B vitamin folate, you find that following the injury, these nerve cells regenerate, which is completely unheard of. And you can imagine the implications of that. So let's say you get into a car accident, or let's say that you have some sort of injury from like a war, like a traumatic injury. Imagine if you could supplement these people that would normally have this condition that would leave them wheelchair bound for life. And you could magically say like, all right, I'm going to regenerate your nerves and you'll be able to walk again, or you'll be able to feel again. So that's kind of the basis of the research, and that's why we were doing what we were doing. And, it's much more complicated than that, but that's really a high level overview of the background and rationale behind our research projects in the lab.
So the lab's been in existence for 20 or so years. Has the lab always been focused on supplementing with folate, or was that a recent discovery?
So as with a lot of scientific research, most of it is serendipitous, which means that you just come across, something that works and you go
Hmm.
with it. So in our case, a student actually in my position, maybe 10 years prior, just suggested, they were trying to regenerate these cells even 20 years back, but they didn't really have any direction to go. And some student just suggested, like, why don't we just try folate? Why don't we try this B vitamin? Because it's not unheard of. It's a pretty common supplement. You could actually buy it over the counter. So they tried it and it actually worked, which was pretty amazing. The real question is, why does it work? And the folate biochemical pathway is incredibly complex. We learn about it a lot in classes. The relationship between the folate pathway and the nervous system is not super clear. So I think that that's the next step for the research is, we now know what's happening. We see this observation, but the next question is why.
Hmm.
So that's kind of where the lab is going, and they're going off on little tangents as well about certain scenarios that can improve the regeneration via folate supplementation and different generations and stuff. But just the big picture is they did see this response, this phenotype as we call it, and now they want to know why.
And so, given this discovery, and I'm sure research was published on it, are there other labs now focused on using folate in this specific research? Was it that big of a discovery that a lot of people have begun working on this problem with this B
So
vitamin?
it's my understanding that the paper that was published was actually incredibly high impact. I believe there was 3 papers published. I think the first one was like 2002, then maybe 2010 and 2012, something like that. So there's 3 in series that were all related to this momentous finding.
Hmm.
And they were published in a big journal. So Nature is, I think it's the most high impact of all scientific journals. So yeah, it was a pretty important finding. A lot of people are skeptical about it too, as with any controversial research or any novel findings. So yeah, people are skeptical about it, but it also is directing a lot of new research. So it seems like, for the most part, spinal cord injury research tends to be related to stem cells, but there definitely is a niche where people are focusing on folate supplementation and how that can impact it. So research is kind of all over the place when it comes to spinal cord injury and the nervous system, the central nervous system, because as you can imagine, this is a huge area that, there's not a lot of research on it so far, or not a lot of tangible results so far in modern medicine. So people want to focus on that. And this is definitely one of the avenues that people have been taking to address those issues.
Hmm. Also, before we move on from this, I was reading a little of this on your LinkedIn, and I talked to Ian, our friend, about the DNA extraction process, and I think you
Mm-hmm.
were probably doing at a high level the same thing, which I'm sure like we're gonna have Ian on the podcast later too. But I found it to be super interesting. Can you give people another high level overview of how you extract DNA and use PCR
You're
to
putting me on the spot right now, Wally. Okay.
I I mean, that's what you're doing,
I don't even
right?
have the protocol in front of me, but I think I can remember.
Give people some knowledge to learn about how just DNA extraction works.
Yeah. So with a lot of studies, mine included, you need to look at the genetic components. And so just to find out, because your genes are controlling how your body changes, how your body grows. Your genes control everything about you, essentially. So they're very important. And genes are essentially just segments and sequences of DNA. So DNA is in almost every single cell of your body, and therefore it can be extracted pretty easily. DNA is in your hair, DNA is in your skin cells. It's all over the place. So what we would do is we would take cells from these animals and through a lot of complicated steps, and I'm not looking at the protocol right now, so I can't tell you exactly. But you add all these chemicals, and it digests certain, these are enzymes that are digesting certain cells and exposing the DNA. And through a series of steps and chemical reactions, you can isolate DNA from the cell. So now you have pure DNA. However, as you can imagine, it's just a little piece of DNA from one cell. So no tests are sensitive enough to just look at that little piece of DNA. You need to amplify it. And so, Wally, you kind of mentioned this. To do that, we use polymerase chain reaction, which also known as PCR, which is just a way to take a very small amount of DNA and to amplify it 100-fold, 10,000-fold, who knows how much. So that way you have a ton of the same DNA, and then you could just put it easily into a machine or into an assay, and you can just see the genetic code. So essentially, at a very high level overview, you can isolate DNA from a cell through a series of chemical steps. Then you take that very small amount of DNA from one single cell or a few cells, and then you can amplify it times 1,000, let's say, and then you can sequence the DNA from that point. And so you know the genes and the genetic composition of this animal.
Mm-hmm. And so were you having to do that for each of the mice or rodents that you were like experimenting on?
So we wouldn't do it for every single rodent, but generally we would do it like for a certain group. So we know that this is one type of genetic composition of a rat versus another kind.
Okay. Well, I thought that was interesting, so I thought I'd have you explain it a little bit. But we can continue on from that. We'll move on to after junior year, you interned at Abbvie in Illinois as an operations intern in their oral drug products division. Like you've said, you're there full time now in a different capacity, but we'll get to that in a minute. Can you tell us about what Abbvie does and what you did during your internship there after junior year?
Yeah. So Abbvie is a global biopharmaceutical company. It's one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, actually, when considering revenue. And their big product is Humira, which is a biologic product, which means that it's essentially an antibody is the best way to put it. And so I know a lot of you guys have been hearing about antibodies with COVID-19 and all that. That's essentially what Humira is, which is their biggest product. So they also, they have a ton of different portfolios, neuroscience. They just acquired Allergan, so now they have aesthetics as another pipeline for them. But yeah, essentially that's all you need to know about them. It's just a very large pharmaceutical company. And more specifically, in my role, I have to be careful because I can't mention any proprietary information, but I was working with oral drug products, which just means pills, basically tablets. And I was doing continuous improvement projects on these tablets. So I was monitoring the dissolution rates of a specific on-market product. And my project intended to characterize the dissolution of these tablets based on the way in which they're stored. So as you can imagine, if you store a tablet in the wrong conditions, whether it be somewhere that's too humid or too hot, then it might not act the same way as a normal tablet would straight off the press. So my research project and my main focus that summer was to establish the conditions that would make it unsuitable to give this to a patient, because it affects certain characteristics like the bioavailability within the patient, which is just how much drug the patient actually gets when it dissolves. So there's some pretty significant supply chain implications for my research because I generated models that gave recommendations on how to store a certain class of tablet.
Mm-hmm. And what was what was your work experience like? Was it what you expected? Did you enjoy the team you were on?
It was definitely, would I say it's what I expected? Probably not. I didn't really know what to expect coming to a pharmaceutical company. I ended up taking a scientific role and I figured that I'd be just fine because I knew, PCR and I knew DNA extraction. So I was like, oh, I'll be just fine working with these scientific concepts. And I was dead wrong. There was a huge learning curve. I was mostly working in the laboratory, about 50% in the laboratory, and then I was at a desk too, interpreting my data. But there's a ton of very interesting machinery and instruments at a pharmaceutical company because they can afford it. So I'm learning how to use all these super complicated instruments. I'm running these tests I've never heard of. So it was pretty much like learning on the job first day. I didn't learn about any of this stuff in my classes. So it was a great experience, and it really strengthened me as a scientist because it's nice to be in a sheltered environment like a university where all your experiments are going to work for the most part because that's how they design them. But then you get into the real world and that's not the case. Like more often than not, your experiment's going to fail. And so I had to learn how to navigate those failures, and troubleshoot was the biggest thing because there was no one holding my hand. They would just send me off into the lab and make sure that I got results at the end of the week. So it was definitely an interesting experience, to say the least.
Yeah. Can you offer any advice for people who are going into an internship like yours, where you may be doing research on the job or working in a lab on the job, and how that differs from university-based labs and research?
Yeah. So I would say that my biggest word of advice, and this is sort of cliche, but it's to challenge yourself. I think that if I would have picked an internship where I was comfortable with all of the laboratory techniques, then I wouldn't have really learned anything because it's essentially the same thing I do from a day-to-day basis. And I think that after pursuing an internship where I had never learned any of these techniques in my classes and I've never even heard of them, I think that that really refined my skill set, and it also provided me with the experience doing something for the first time. And so that's something that I definitely advertised about myself and I leveraged when getting my return offer, was the fact that I had limited experience in the first place and I was able to learn on the job and learn quickly. So I think that that's something that's super important when working in industry and working in a research setting, is that you don't necessarily need to be an expert at the beginning, but you should certainly be able to pick things up quickly and devote yourself to a task to learn it well.
Definitely. And we didn't talk about it, but this leads into it perfectly. How did you go about getting that internship? I imagine a company like Abbvie is pretty competitive to get into. And what do you think made you successful in first getting an interview and then eventually getting the job?
Yeah, so I actually got the job through the career fair junior year. What I ended up doing was just going and speaking to the booth. And I had actually gone the year prior with absolutely no luck. I'm sure they just threw my resume right out the window. So I would say that the most important thing is actually come with a strong resume that has no typos and is formatted well, because that's really the first thing they see about you. But I would say that another thing that really contributed to my success in the interview and onboarding phase was being genuine about my interests. I came in very interested about the pharmaceutical industry. I had previously, read a lot about drug pricing, and it was something that I was passionate about. And I also came in with all sorts of research experience. And also, I actually leveraged my interests in patient care and in healthcare in general. So it just so happened that Abbvie as a company is very interested in the patient, the end user of their product. Patient centricity is a big thing at this organization. And so by leveraging my passion for healthcare, which I had developed years prior in my volunteer experiences, I think that that really stood out to them. And I think that that's what at least got me my foot in the door, so to speak. And then I just, during the interview process, I think that leveraging my strengths and just picking out those experiences, whether they were from my student organizations or volunteer experiences, really helped to sell me as a candidate. And I'm sure that's why they selected me ultimately. And one other thing too, that's important to note is, so I'm in the operations internship and now I'm in the operations development program, and I'm actually the only non-engineer. So almost every single person is a chemical engineer. I'm the only one with a non-traditional background. And I think that that's something else that's super important. I realized prior to interviewing and prior to applying to these programs that I would be different. And a lot of times different is good because you have a different viewpoint on things. and you can provide new insights. You might catch something that someone else with an engineering degree wouldn't realize. So that's something that I really used as a strength of mine, and I continued to advertise about myself. And I think that that's something that they really liked about me too, is to get that diversity of thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something for people to consider for sure when they're looking for jobs. You don't always have to fit the mold of a job description. Many companies are simply looking for smart and hardworking students for their internships, and a lot can be taught on the job. So now, do you want to talk about, you mentioned it a bit before, but with your other research, you started working on another project on the side with the doctor you're doing research with, and you eventually got selected for this highly competitive research fellowship called the Hilldale Fellowship, and it's awarded to undergraduate researchers at UW, and you receive funding, and you ended up focusing your research on hydrocephalus and future therapies for that. Do you want to talk about, first of all, what that is and what the purpose of your research was?
Yeah, so I'll give a high level overview of hydrocephalus first, and then I'll go into my research. So, hydrocephalus is a brain condition that you're typically born with, and it's essentially a buildup of fluid in your brain, in two chambers of your brain. And so, as you can imagine, this buildup of fluid causes high pressure in your brain. There is one treatment, however, which is a pretty invasive surgical procedure, and it's the implantation of a shunt, the ventriculoperitoneal shunt. And so, what a shunt is basically a valve that drains this fluid out of your brain. The problem with that, and the problem with shunts, is that the design of this medical device hasn't actually changed for over 50 years. So the valve is pretty, I don't think archaic is the right word for it, but it's, it hasn't been redesigned recently. And so there are certain flaws associated with it. One of these flaws is chronic overdrainage of the ventricles of the brain, which are these two chambers that fill up with fluid. What we suspect is that the shunt drains all the fluid and more. And so it causes your brain to kind of dry up and shrivel up. Your brain is, it's a pliable tissue. So it needs to remain hydrated to some extent. If you just kind of let it dry up, then it can get hard and it doesn't really bend, or it's not as malleable, I guess. So that can lead to severe headaches, is what we assume, or is what we presume, I should say. So these patients, hydrocephalus patients with these shunts that are implanted at birth or at a very young age, experience some of the most painful headaches ever. The problem with these headaches, though, is that they're not treated as like a very specific condition to these individuals. They kind of just treat it and they throw it in the bucket with people that have migraines. So basically, long story short, they have these super painful headaches, these patients, but they're not getting the right treatment just because we don't even consider them to have a unique condition. So what we're doing is, and this is my research, study and my proposed research that got me the Hilldale Fellowship, was we're actually building a smartphone application for both iOS and Android. And this smartphone application is going to be survey-based, and it's going to be utilized by many different groups of patients. Many of them will have hydrocephalus, some of them might have migraines, and some of them might even have no condition whatsoever and just be kind of like a control group. And this application is going to survey these patients multiple times per day, asking them about their headache symptoms, if they've taken any drugs, if they've done any exercise, things like that. And so we're trying to gauge if there's any correlation between these super painful headaches that these hydrocephalus patients suffer from, and if there's any correlation with the drugs they're taking or the activities they've done that day, their stress levels. And even further than that, we're going to compare that to other types of headaches, like migraines. And so what we're trying to do is establish a new problem and say, hey, these hydrocephalus headaches are super unique and they're very different from migraine headaches. So we should be treating them in a completely different way. So long story short, we want to establish a new problem for these hydrocephalus patients so we can refine these treatments and change the design of these shunts that have remained for over 50 years.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And how far along in the process are you? I assume will you just look for volunteers who have hydrocephalus to use the app
So
initially?
pretty interesting you ask that. Hydrocephalus is one of the most common procedures for pediatric neurosurgeons, which is my boss's position. So I believe it comprises something like 50% of all pediatric neurosurgery cases, which means that the researcher I work with, Dr. Iskandar, that's most of his patients have this condition. And obviously he has a huge network of fellow colleagues who are also pediatric neurosurgeons. So between the patient, the clientele that we have within our own network and within other networks like the Hydrocephalus Foundation and things like that, we have a wide exposure to these patients who would be willing to join our trial and who would be incentivized to join. So we're looking at, hosting a very large scale study. It's not something that's going to have like 20 patients, 30 patients. We're looking more in the order of like 5,000 patients or more to be supported by this application.
Wow. So when is that planned to begin?
Yeah, so you can get me started on this. I could talk about this all day, but we've experienced some delays with the paperwork. There's a lot of legalities that are involved when you're making an application that collects patient data. So there's something called HIPAA, which I don't know exactly what the acronym stands for, like Health Information Privacy something Act. And it's basically something that keeps all patient information private. Like when you go to the hospital, this is the act that prevents your information from being shared or being talked about between physicians. It's something that keeps you safe, your information safe. So on our project, we've had involvement from a lot of different legal experts, attorneys, things like that, just to help us work out the specifics of taking the data. And there's a ton of logistics that need to go into this behind the scenes. So after months of work, this is actually much more than I anticipated, but after months of working behind the scenes to really iron out all the details, make sure that we have data collection that's encrypted, things like that, we're finally getting to the process of building the application. So we're actually outsourcing the application. I'm not too well versed in smartphone application design, believe it or not. So we have a company who's based in New York and also in Croatia who will be building it for us. And then the University of Wisconsin is going to take ownership of that application once it's built. And so right now I'm overseeing the production of this application, and I'm kind of serving as the kind of the bridge between healthcare providers and the people that are planning the study. And I'm very involved in the planning of the study itself, as well as working with these technical professionals to develop this application and build it. And so I'm working on both ends to create this project. So we're about to begin building this application. It's going to take about 2 to 3 months, I assume. So we should be with a tangible product closer to the end of this year, closer to the fall. So that's when we're going to have the application. We're going to obviously run beta testing on it to make sure that it's functional and it works. And then we're going to embark on the process of actually getting patients to join our study. But it's also worth noting, like, this application has only so many features, and we've been also experimenting with or entertaining the idea of implementing even more features. And so, for example, like ours is just survey based, but we've actually collaborated with some very high profile collaborators from Harvard University, for example. We worked with one of the most prominent data scientists in the world. Jukka-Pekka Onella is his name. And so he has an application over there in Cambridge, and it basically collects patient data while you're not using your phone. So let's say that you go on a run and your phone's in your pocket. It has that gyroscopic data that's being collected. So then it could tell you how vigorous was your run, or how vigorous was the phone shaking in your pocket, and the distance you traveled. So it's always collecting data behind the scenes. And we've definitely entertained the idea of adding this additional feature later on once we know that this application is working, because we don't want to complicate it too much right from the start. But there's so many other avenues that we can take with this and collect more robust data. So that's definitely something that we are considering at the moment.
Yeah, I'm super excited about that space,
Mm,
making just in general wearable healthcare data available to doctors to better customize the healthcare
yeah.
experience. So, once you can define the issue that's causing hydrocephalus, are there any next steps you guys have in mind, or is that really the end goal of the project?
So in an ideal world, once we can establish that this is the true issue, is that it's has to do with chronic overdrainage of these shunts, then the logical next step is to redesign the shunt. So I think that's part of the issue, is that physicians can't seem to agree on what the actual cause of these headaches is. If you look um,
Mm-hmm.
at the data, and actually research studies have been conducted about this, pediatric neurosurgeons all across the country are divided about what's causing these. Maybe like 10%, 20% think it's overdrainage. Another 20% think it's misplacement of the shunt itself. Some think that it's a technological defunction or technological issue with the shunt itself, things like that. So
Mm-hmm.
no one can really agree on it, but that's the first step, is to get everyone on board and say, provide them evidence that says, actually, this is certainly, without a doubt, the issue that's causing these headaches. Because then once you get everyone on board, then everyone starts looking for the solution. So I think that, yeah, the logical next step is to redesign the shunt once we can provide evidence that suggests that this is the issue. And I don't think that we're going to pass it on to someone else. I could even imagine myself working
Mm-hmm.
on that. I'm right now in the pharmaceutical industry. My new role is closely related to medical devices. So it just kind of makes sense. And I think that that's also something that I talked about in my interviews for my current role, is my involvement in the generation of a new ventriculoperitoneal shunt. So hopefully we'll do it ourselves, but you never know.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll have to do a follow-up
Yeah,
episode in like a year or two down the road, something like that. So, before we finish up your college story, you obviously had a super close relationship with this doctor that you did research with. Do you have any advice for other college students or students going into college on developing close relationships with professors? Because I think a lot of people go through college without taking full advantage of the faculty available to them.
sure. Yeah, so I'm sure it's pretty obvious to the listeners how I developed this relationship with this professor. So I'm actually going to talk about a different professor
Mm-hmm.
I developed a relationship with, which was a little bit more organic, I guess you could say. So this professor was actually my Spanish professor. She is the director of the Spanish program, Spanish and Portuguese, at UW-Madison. And so for those of you that don't know, I also speak Spanish. And I think that I became passionate about my use of Spanish when I volunteered directly out of high school at a clinic in Humboldt Park in Chicago. So this clinic serves a predominantly Puerto Rican community, and most of the patients actually did not speak English whatsoever. So I'm a non-native Spanish speaker. I took AP Spanish in high school, and this role really challenged me to speak Spanish all the time, because most of the patients were English speakers, but there's maybe once or twice a day where I would answer the phone and it's someone speaking on Spanish trying to make an appointment for the doctor. And so I don't have backup, because all of our technicians and all of the physicians are with patients. So I'm the only person that can solve this issue, and I had to figure it out. So I think that that really opened my eyes to the benefits and the utility of speaking a foreign language in healthcare. And I actually speak three languages. Not it's not only Spanish. I also speak Polish because my mom is from Poland. But that's kind of besides the point.
Mm-hmm.
So when I came to Madison, I didn't really anticipate getting a major or anything in Spanish. I just wanted to continue with my Spanish speaking abilities. I really saw that there was room for me to improve, and I saw the utility in speaking that other language from a professional standpoint. So I pursued that, and I tried to mix my passion and my interests in healthcare and in drug related crises as well with my Spanish speaking. So I got to this professor's class, and she really let me go on my own when it came to my writing assignments. And I often wrote about things that were medically related and things like the opioid epidemic and stuff like that, albeit in Spanish. So we really developed a relationship, and I would often go to her office hours to just chat with her about stuff. And she became a great mentor to me. Um, Again, she wasn't like, providing me with any insight on how I could be a better farm worker in the pharmaceutical industry, nothing like that. But it was just providing me with a unique opportunity to talk about something outside of my normal classes. And so, first of all, it just kind of broadened my horizons a little bit and really challenged me to think in a different perspective, and also building that relationship organically based on my interests and my passions, and just being open with her really helped facilitate that, and which is the reason why she's still very close to me and why I talk to her even now.
That's a great story and shows you should go to your professor's office hours for sure. So we graduated together this spring, and you just started your job at Abbvie. You've talked a little bit about it so far, but now you're a product quality engineer in the medical device and combination products division. Can you tell us about that division and more about what your role is in the development program that
Sure.
you're in?
So I'm in the operations development program, first of all, which is just I guess, one step up from my internship program. And the program is 3 years. It offers me a comprehensive view of operations in the pharmaceutical industry and in a pharmaceutical company, which includes things like science and technology, manufacturing, quality assurance, things like that. So really a technical role. And within that, so as you mentioned, I'm a product quality engineer, and I focus on medical products such as medical devices and combination products. For those of you who don't know, combination products it's like a mix of a drug and a medical device. So like, for example, medicine within a syringe, you have the medicine and you have the syringe. When you put it together, it's a combination product. So that's just like an example of that. And so specifically within my role, what I'm responsible for is quality assurance of the manufacture of these medical devices. So let's say that we have our manufacturing plant, and there's a fault within the machinery, and it might generate poor labeling, or there might be an issue with the mold of a certain plastic component of a medical device. These are very serious complaints that can result in a patient receiving, inadequate drug, or not receiving their treatment altogether, things like that. So as you can imagine, there's very serious implications for this. It's my responsibility to sometimes recognize that there's an issue. Sometimes the issue is a complaint that's brought to my attention, but it's my responsibility to resolve these issues. So it's my understanding that a majority of my role is going to be implementing corrective and preventative actions. So I'll be working specifically with the plants to make sure that if there has been an issue with manufacturing these medical devices and combination products, that we really get to the bottom of it and solve the issue at hand that's causing this problem, and then make sure that it doesn't happen in the future, so that we can ensure a robust drug supply, a robust medical device and combination product supply, and ultimately give a really high performing product to our end user, which is the patient.
And so what's the development program look like? Are you basically learning and shadowing for all 3 years, or are you gonna begin the actual responsibilities of the job during the
So
program?
the program itself is 3 years long, and within those 3 years, it's comprised of 3 different 1 year rotations. So my first rotation is product quality engineering. My second rotation could be anything from manufacturing to a laboratory scientist, anything like that. And then the third rotation, again, could be anything. So it's not necessarily like a shadowing program. We assume these very real responsibilities. And pretty soon, I'm still early on in my role. So I'm still training and getting prepared for the true responsibilities. But yeah, I will be assuming real responsibilities. I will be the point of contact for the global manufacturing facilities, which are all over the world. Some of my colleagues who are in the manufacturing plants, they're not watching, they're actually running the lines, or or directing the lines, I should say, to make sure that that things are running smoothly. And if an issue arises, let's say a line goes down or something like that, that's a serious concern for the medical inventory and supply, and that's their responsibility. So yeah, it's really high stakes. And yeah, again, I kind of mentioned this earlier too, but I'm the only one without an engineering degree in this role. So I know my job title says engineer, but by training and by trade, I have a pharmaceutical background. So it's kind of interesting to be put in this position and really learn on the job. So that's going to be something that's super valuable to me, is the ability to learn on my feet and absorb things like a sponge.
Yeah. What area of the business and your job are you most excited
I'm
about?
really excited to learn more about medical devices and combination products. I know that much of my knowledge so far is technical, like with the drugs themselves, but I think that that's another important thing, is the way that these drugs are delivered. So, especially given my interests and my research interests in hydrocephalus and creating those revised shunts, this goes hand in hand with that. And so, learning how they're manufactured and everything behind the scenes when there's an issue with manufacturing a medical device is super interesting to me. So, this is something that you fail to consider, like all the time you might go to the store and pick up, let's say, NyQuil. So, NyQuil comes with the bottle, and then it also comes with that cap, which makes it a combination product. But you fail to consider all the times that there might have been an issue on the line or in the manufacturing facilities, and all the hardship that went in to provide you with that nice working product. So I'm really excited to learn more about that behind the scenes stuff.
Yeah, that'll be super interesting. How have you enjoyed work so far with your peers? Are you in the facility, or are you working
So
virtually
I'm
right
actually
now?
in an office building. I'm working in person. I'm actually one of the few people at the
Okay.
company that are working in person right now. And it's an awesome role. I'm really enjoying it so far. Love my coworkers and my colleagues. But something that's really awesome about this specific role is how cross-functional it is. So every day I'm going to be interacting with people across the globe, whether they're in our manufacturing facilities in Ireland or whether they're down the road in Chicago, working out the logistics with finances and working with the scientists in the laboratory. I'm interacting with all these different groups, and I think that that's something that's super important for young professionals, is the ability to be a cross-functional leader and really manage a cross-functional team. So I'm super excited and really looking forward to that opportunity to work with such a diverse set of people, and come together to address a common goal and come to a common solution.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the benefits of a global company
Hmm.
with global customers for sure. All right, so you're in this rotational program now at Abbvie, and at least in the beginning of college, you were thinking primarily about med school. Is that still something that's on your mind? Are you thinking a couple years, few years down the road, that you still want to pursue that path? Or, and not to add too much to the question, but what would have to happen for you at Abbvie over the next couple years to make you want to continue down the corporate path or the pharmaceutical path and not go to med school?
Yeah. So to answer your question, I think that ultimately I've always wanted to become a doctor. And I think that caring for patients on a personal level is something that has always been important to me ever since I learned of that passion of mine in high school. So I think that ultimately that's still the plan, is to become a physician. But that being said, I don't have any plans currently to pursue that, to any degree right now. So I'm more interested in pursuing my interests and seeing where that will take me. I'm really in no rush to fulfill my ultimate goals, if that makes sense. So, I've been interested about pharmaceuticals for since high school as well. Ever since I shadowed a pharmacist and I stepped foot into the pharmacy and saw some of these life-saving drugs that I've heard about on TV, I was like, wow, this is super interesting. And by going into the pharmaceutical industry, I've been able to satisfy those interests, and I've developed new ones, like with medical devices and stuff. So, I'm definitely interested in continuing to pursue the career that I'm in now and seeing where that's going to take me. And who knows down the line, 5-10 years where I'm going to be, because I really don't know myself. I'm pretty short-sighted when it comes to fulfilling my interests and pursuing my short-term goals. I do have those long-term career goals, but where those two connect, I'm not exactly sure. So right now I'm just focusing on my interests and my passions, and I think that I'm in a good place to do that at the moment.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just listening to, I forget who it was on the Tim Ferriss podcast, but he was just really harping on that, on how people have so many interests and they want to do so many things, and they think they have to choose, or they think they have to do them all at one time. But we live a long life, especially just coming out of college. You can do a lot of the things that you want to do. Just spend a couple years doing each of them, and spread them out. Don't try to do them all at once.
Yeah, I would definitely say, like, a lot of my classmates from school really rushed into pursuit of a medical career or whatever they wanted. And not to say that that's wrong. They were passionate about what they did, and I applaud them and I support them. But just for me, I'm not in such a rush to pursue these things. Healthcare is a noble career, but it's one that's very involved. And I can definitely see the value that I bring to patients in my current role as well. So I'm kind of trying to see how that fits into my career aspirations, how that fits into my passion for patient care and patient centricity. So yeah, I'm really in no rush to figure those things out. And I think that the best way to decide what's best for me is by getting that experience.
Makes sense. I want to talk about pharmaceutical drug pricing. It's obviously a huge debate in the US, a pretty bipartisan issue, that drug prices are seemingly too high. And usually there's a lot of cases where drug prices are a lot higher in the US compared to other countries for the same drug. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the issue. Do you think drug prices are too high in the US? Do you think there's any ways that we can kind of resolve this issue?
Yeah, I just want to make a little disclaimer. I think I'm legally obligated to make this disclaimer that the views I'm about to express are solely those of my own and not of Abbvie. So I just want to make that clear. But yeah, no, this is something that I've been passionate about. And I think that, let me first explain to the people at home, like, the origins of this interest of mine. So I mentioned that I was working in that clinic in Humboldt Park in Chicago. And that was my first introduction to healthcare disparities. So healthcare disparity is just basically a gap in healthcare. Like, one group is receiving very equitable healthcare and very, they have a ton of accessibility to various resources, whereas another group, maybe based on the color of their skin or their sexual identity or something like that, their gender identity, they could be receiving worse healthcare. And specifically in this instance, I witnessed a patient spill their medication and absolutely lose it. I don't think hysterical is an appropriate word to use in this situation, but you can imagine this patient was distraught. And I was kind of wondering why. Honestly, I was pretty sheltered. I had just come from my comfortable suburban lifestyle. I was like, why don't they just, we could call the pharmacy and they'll get a refill. And then I realized when I called the pharmacy to get that refill, I understood their pain because they couldn't afford the drug. So that's when it really became pretty apparent to me that there are people that cannot afford drugs, and it's pretty sad. So knowing that, yeah, I am pretty critical of healthcare pricing practices in the United States. Although I've been thinking about this for a long time, Wally, and I'll tell you that I don't think that the solution is very clear to this issue because, I must concede that there are huge profit margins in the pharmaceutical industry, and these CEOs are making a ton of money. You compare them to another industry, for example, the profit margins are just completely massive in the pharmaceutical industry. So yeah, I think that could change on a local level. And I think that would do some good. But if you think about the issue, it's so much deeper than that. So pharmaceutical industries, or pharmaceutical companies rather, are basically made to turn a profit. That's just kind of the point of them. So they sell these drugs for a super high price so they can fund their research and development of more drugs. So then they could sell those drugs and make more money to fund their research. It's just a cycle like that. And so who's to blame? Is it these insurance companies that are charging these high premiums? Is it these pharmaceutical companies for wanting to turn a profit? Is it a capitalistic society we live in where we have these companies that are functioning to make profits? So yeah, I think that the issue is incredibly complex, and obviously, I don't have a solution to it, and I don't think anyone else does either, because otherwise we would have figured this out by now. But yeah, I think that a good first place to start is to reduce profiteering in the industry. I think that taking a pay cut for the CEO is a great first step, but that's kind of like a band-aid on the issue. That's not going to solve the problem long term. And so yeah, I think that for now, healthcare providers are trying to address these healthcare disparities on a local level, but until there's some systemic change, I don't know that there's any solutions I've found to drug pricing.
Yeah, it's clearly a problem that no one knows the answer to.
Yeah.
I know there was a lot that went on maybe earlier this year or the year before with basically, I know they called like a bunch of the CEOs of the drug companies to Congress and to testify. And their argument was that basically the US is funding a lot of the drug research for the world. And most countries will, if they give a patent or if they give certain monopolistic benefits to like a drug company, they'll have pricing power for that company and basically set prices in the market, where the US doesn't do that. So basically their argument was that they have to charge such high prices in the US because they can't charge it anywhere else in the world, and they need to fund their R&D costs, like you said. And so that's the only way they can do it. I don't know if you know any more about that topic or if that's just kind of like a cover up.
I am a little familiar with that. An interesting thing I will mention, you kind of touched on this a little bit, is the legal battles that these companies mount to protect their patents. They're protecting their intellectual property. And to a certain extent, I can support that. This is their intellectual property after all. But then you let's look at the statistics, for example. If you look at, I forget the year, maybe 2018 or something, and you look at the highest paid non-executives in the city of Chicago, and I'm sure in the whole country, it's lawyers for pharmaceutical companies. They don't host or hold an executive title or anything like that. They're simply really good at protecting these patents, which saves these companies billions of dollars. So what if we weren't so concerned about protecting intellectual property of these companies? What if we actually promoted the generation of biosimilars and of drugs that do the same thing at a lower cost? In other words, generic drugs. A lot of these companies protect their property by receiving these patents, and then the market is essentially inaccessible to that drug. So they protect those with a ton of money, and they pay their lawyers accordingly.
Yeah, I think it's an unfortunate side effect of basically having patents, I suppose. But they certainly have a big benefit, and that is to promote innovation.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure there's a fine line, probably like you've alluded to, have strayed too far from that line to one side.
I mean, here's like a question. Maybe the people at home can ponder this one. Do you think that it's ethical to be marketing these drugs to people who are not educated on their own healthcare? Like, we have drug commercials in the United States. Believe it or not, we're the only country that does that. Nowhere else in the world they're going to tell you to tell your doctor to prescribe you something, because your doctor and your pharmacist is the most well-versed in how these drugs work, and they know what's best for you, not a TV commercial. So I don't know. I'm not going to speak to that. Hopefully our listeners at home can think about that one next time you see a drug commercial on TV.
I learned that this year too. I thought I thought that was crazy. I didn't realize we are really, as far as I know, the only country that has prescription drug commercials.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to make much sense to me. But like you said, we'll leave it to the
Yeah,
viewers.
exactly.
I guess last thing I want to touch on this topic is you mentioned a little bit about insurance, and a topic that's brought up a lot regarding this problem is that basically insurance companies will hire intermediaries or insurance companies themselves will basically have the pricing power to force pharmaceutical companies to give them discounts for their specific plans or
Hmm.
rebates. And that makes prices so much higher. And really, the prices these insurance companies are paying are much lower than the insurance price. But still, their customers are paying a percentage of the sticker price. And obviously, the
Yeah.
uninsured people are paying the sticker price. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. It seems like it's clearly a problem to me, but maybe a part of the bigger problem of the lack of transparency in the insurance industry.
Yeah. So one thing that, we're taking steps in the right direction is it seems that the government is going to make it so that drug pricing and healthcare pricing is more transparent. That would allow patients to essentially shop around and say, all right, this hospital is going to charge me $1,500 for an MRI. I don't know if that's an accurate price, it's probably more, but this hospital is going to charge me only $900. And so I think that that's a step in the right direction, because then it removes some of that burden from the patient and really challenges insurance companies to be a little bit more transparent. I'm not super well versed in this whole concept of transparency and insurance and stuff like that, but I do know that this is definitely a step in the right direction, although this system is still incredibly convoluted. So I looked myself, I think it was a year ago or so, I looked at these examples of transparent healthcare pricing, and I don't think I understood a thing looking at this document. I'm sure the only person that could understand that is like an insurance specialist or a doctor with like 20 years of experience. So
Mm-hmm.
how can you force a patient to read and understand this incredibly complex document of healthcare pricing when even an industry specialist can't? So I think that, yeah, it's a step in the right direction, this transparency, because then it's going to force these companies to be a little bit more honest about their practices. But there's still a long way to go, because they're just confusing, and it's really doing no good to the people that need it the most.
Yeah, it'll be interesting what happens with policy, and it sounds like an area, if we are to keep the same system, an area for companies to step in to be that intermediary, to be able to decipher the different insurance documentation and different products available to customers, and be able to just help customers out and figuring out which how they can save money,
Mm-hmm.
basically. But I guess that's a huge topic that we could go on forever
Yeah.
with, I guess, but we'll move on from that and we'll just go into some rapid fire
All right.
questions if you're ready for them.
I don't know if I'm ready, but let's do it.
All right. Well, what was your favorite class in
My
college?
favorite class was beer making class, also known as the science of fermentation. So this was an elective that we had. It counted as a biochemistry class, and there must have been a couple days worth of biochemistry before we started doing beer making and like taste testing and stuff like that. So we actually brewed our own beer, and did a couple field trips too to local Madison breweries. So my group, I forget what we brewed, maybe like a red ale or something like that. And my claim to fame is that
Mhm.
we had a pitcher that we were giving to our classmates of our home brew while we were presenting our final presentation. So everyone had a beer in their hand, which is pretty cool.
That's awesome. That is just the most Wisconsin class there is. Okay, tell me what's one of your favorite books or most recent favorite books?
Let's see. One of my most recent favorite books, it's called Pharmacology, but it's spelled like an animal farm. So FARM. It's written by Daphne Miller, and this book is it's a pretty interesting concept that basically suggests that the food in which we eat actually plays a huge role in our overall well-being. And so then it kind of poses the question, like, shouldn't we consider farmers to be part of our healthcare provider network, because the type of farming that they use, whether it's organic soil farming or things like that, and the farming techniques that they use can really benefit your overall well-being, your gut bacteria, which can play a huge role in your immune system. So it's a super thought-provoking, kind of hippie book, but I would recommend it to everyone to read that because it's an awesome book.
I'll have to read that for sure, because I've been super interested in the gut microbiome, and just my knowledge is just from some podcasts I've been listening to. But it sounds really fascinating, all the relationships they're finding with it and all the research that's coming out and new probiotics and focus on that area. How about your favorite podcast?
I'm going to be honest, Wally, I don't listen to many podcasts.
That's all right. You can just say
let's skip this
pod.
question. I guess it's the Wally pod.
Okay, yeah. I'll take it.
Hey guys, my name is Kyle Zielinski and you're listening to the Wally pod. Yes. There you go.
Okay, how about, do you have any physical or mental health habits that you think everyone could do or have really benefited you?
I think that one thing for me personally, this is what I do to tolerate my stress levels, is just fitness. Even if it's going for a walk, you don't have to be weightlifting or anything like that. But I think that getting my heart rate up a little bit and just clearing my mind helps me pretty significantly manage my stress levels. And I think that's what keeps me pretty level-headed when I'm dealing with all these, issues that come up at work or in school. I was pretty stressed out. So yeah, I think that just getting out and getting some fresh air, maybe getting some fitness, doing some fitness is something that's super valuable.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. If you were to go back to first day of freshman year, would you give yourself any one piece of advice?
I think that the one piece of advice I would give myself is to shake more hands. I think that networking is very valuable, and now I could see it, especially working in corporate America. I can't tell you how many people I've met where they have gotten to where they are, or that certain opportunities have presented themselves because of who they knew, and nothing wrong with that. I wish that I had those opportunities, and I think that even if you're not born with these connections, let's say that your parents didn't provide you with these connections, there's no stopping you from making them yourself. So I think that if I would have known how truly valuable these connections are, then I probably would have tried to meet more people from a professional standpoint.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. And especially for people, especially if you're in college, but definitely all aspects of life, there's an incredible amount of diverse and just really smart people on college campuses. And oftentimes you don't know the stories of people until you ask them about it. So I totally agree with that, and definitely think that everyone should take advantage of their time in college to do that. If you could have dinner with any three people, dead or alive, who would you have him with?
I think I would choose John Muir, the father of the National Park System. Super interesting guy, and I'm sure I could, I'd like to hear his perspective on the outdoors. I think that the second person I would want is is he a Madison native, Frank Lloyd Wright?
Yeah.
He's a Wisconsinite, right? Yeah, so I'm pretty interested in design and architecture, just kind of like a little side interest for me. So I think that he would be the second. And then the third person I would have to say is Jay Leno. First of all, I think that Jay Leno is actually hilarious, but also I'm a pretty big car guy. So I think that, me and Jay might get along. I might learn a couple new jokes, and maybe he'd let me drive a car or two. So that's awesome. My squad of three people.
Yeah, that's a good squad. Would you have them have dinner together with them or separately?
I'm kind of curious. I know that John Muir was buddies with Teddy Roosevelt. I know Teddy was a big jokester, so maybe John is, he likes his way around a joke too. So I think that maybe him and Jay together would be pretty interesting.
Yeah, Frank Lloyd Wright would be a wild card, maybe.
Frank Lloyd Wright, we don't know about that guy, but yeah, maybe. I think I'd probably do it all together.
Yeah. What's your best tip for making the world a better place?
I think that my best tip is, here's a good one. Think global, act local. So, there are certain issues that are pervasive across the globe and among societies, but I think that our preliminary focus, sometimes these problems are so large that you don't know where to start. So why not start in your own community? So again, like I said, I'm passionate about these healthcare disparities that I saw, and they're at a large scale. There's a lot of different moving parts. There's various drug pricing issues, and there's racial inequity and social unrest and injustice that contributes to these disparities. And it's such a big problem, but the best way to start is just by addressing those in your own community. And if everyone has that mentality, then large scale change is entirely possible in a short amount of time.
Mm-hmm. That's really good for everyone to think about. And I think that's a good spot to end the podcast. So thank you, Kyle, very much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Wally, for having me.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed. I'll be releasing a new episode each week, so please subscribe and rate the podcast. It's really helpful for me as I try to expand to more listeners. I'd also love to hear any feedback or questions you may have. My email is in the About section of the podcast. I'm Wally Estenson, and you've been listening to the Wally Pod.